Well, look, that brings us to the end of mini topics and the news. Dave, shall we get on to Sontarans?
So, Rob.
Yes, Dave.
Why are we discussing the Sontarans?
Look, from time to time we discuss what we're going to do in the months ahead, and I was keen to do this one. I don't know about you. I know we both agreed on it, but for me, they're not one of the big two with the Daleks and Cybermen, but they're still up there. And, so although this could have maybe been a Sea Devils and Silurians episode, I think they're on the same footing as them. And I just kind of had this gut feeling that I wanted to talk Sontarans, because maybe they're not spoken about on a lot of podcasts even. I'm just trying to think if any of the podcasts I listen to have really spoken about them. I don't think they have.
Yeah, they seem to be a little bit forgotten, which is extraordinary when you actually think about their contribution to the show. Now, you have the Daleks are sort of the accepted number one Doctor Who recurring monster, and some Cybermen are accepted number two. But after that, there are actually very few classic series returning monsters, and I think that the Sontarans are the only ones that get to come back not just 4 times, which the Ice Warriors do as well, but 4 times over 11 years with 3 different Doctors in very different circumstances. The Autons only get 2 shots and it's with 1 Doctor. The Yeti, 2 shots, 1 Doctor. The Mara, 2 shots, 1 Doctor. But actually being brought back again and again and again over a long period, and then stretching into the wilderness years where they are very important, and then to come back in the new series where Russell T Davies had this thing of, I'm going to bring back a big classic villain every season, and the first was the Daleks, the second was the Cybermen, the third was the Master. Gets to series 4 and it's the Sontarans. They are the next one that he wants to bring back. So they do seem to have a really big claim to being the number 3 recurring monster in Who, but don't kind of really feel like they're up on the pedestal.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And look, I thought before we go any further, I'd read from the Book of Russell, also known as the Doctor Who Encyclopedia by Gary Russell. For those of you out there who want a quick rundown of the Sontarans, cloned warrior species from the planet Sontar, the Sontarans numbered their forces in the millions, with thousands of new cloned warriors hatching every few minutes. The Sontarans had been at war for millennia with the Rutan host, and were bred for war and nothing else. Dying in battle was the ultimate honour, and without honour, Sontarans saw no point in existing. Each Sontaran only had one weakness, the probic vent on the back of their armour, through which nutrients were fed. If struck, this could stun and immobilise a warrior, meaning that a Sontaran trooper would never turn his back on an enemy. Because of their love of war, the Sontarans were devastated to be ostracised by those involved in the last great Time War.
That's very up to date.
Here endeth the reading.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It covers some things that I'm going to be talking about as we sort of get to their appearances. But the last thing I do want to say as the opening is, like the Daleks and like the Cybermen, they do have a very recognisable image and a very memorable image, to the point that I think that first reveal of the Sontaran, particularly when Lynx removes his helmet in the Time Warrior, is, I think, considered an iconic image, an iconic moment of the show.
Yeah, well look, like we say, they aren't Daleks or Cybermen, but they've had such a good run in New Who. And well, I say that, they've only got one real proper story, but they have loads of mentions and cameos. And of course the Strax character is part of all these other stories. So they're sort of like wallpaper now, even to New Who fans. They aren't just some crusty old thing from one story back in 1973 or something. They are actually around a lot, and yet still fly under the radar. They're very curious like that.
Yeah, they really do, and we will explore that. Rob, personal views. Do you like them? Are they a favourite monster of yours? Where do they sit for you?
Yeah, look, weirdly, like the Cybermen, they've never really worked for me on TV that much. There are things I like about their TV appearances. We'll get to that. I tend to like them more as an idea than what we see on TV. It's almost like people don't know what to do with them once they've pulled them out of the toy box. Like, okay, here's the Sontarans, what do we do? Oh, I don't know, maybe they do some experiments or invade, or I don't know. So they're very unusual to me in that way as well.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of their stories. I think they've got some really good stories right across the canon. I think that the individual characters are often more interesting than the race. And we'll be looking at that certainly in their first couple of stories in a moment. A question that I'm going to be asking us both as we move through this episode is something you alluded to just then as well, and that is, do they ever live up to that concept of the species and of the monster that you just read out from that encyclopedia? And I'll leave that now as an open-ended question.
I have an answer for it, but it's going to take us a while to get there.
Yeah, good. well, let's get started then. Obviously, we said they have 4 big appearances in the classic era. The Time Warrior and Lynx. I'll kick us off here, Rob, and just say, please. This is an example of what I was just talking about, where the character of Lynx rises above the fact that he is just a Sontaran from the planet Sontar. That is a memorable character that is really put together by a costume, a mask, and an actor, Kevin Lindsay, that really brings out a lot, but backed up by Robert Holmes, who's clearly having a lot of fun with the script, and he's throwing in a lot of nice details. That stuff about the Pro-Big Vent, the stuff about them being clones. He doesn't understand gender and sexual diversity. Even little lines about, he comes from a high gravity planet, so his muscles are designed for load bearing rather than leverage. That's completely relevant to the plot. But you feel as though you've got a real character and a real alien in here, and I think that works really well in a fun story. Rob, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, Lynx seems very capable and potentially deadly. I think he's great in that way, and as you say, there's that wonderful Holmes dialogue. Although he still falls into that children's TV sort of trap where he doesn't end up acting incredibly realistically. I mean, Dave, he doesn't need to make friends with the guys at the castle. His hired help he's bringing in from the 20th century. He could mow down everyone at the castle and just get on with things and not be arsing about, making robots for them and stuff like that. But the type of TV it is means he has to be doing those things. So I like the idea of him and I like what he's capable of, but in practice, he doesn't quite strike me as acting like he should or could or should.
So a couple of points in reply to that, because I did note as well that the scriptwriter and or the production team were clearly not confident enough in the Sontaran that they thought he could carry the show himself, and therefore they bring in Iron Gron and they bring in Blood Axe and they have that all there. I actually really like that though, because I think it does make him feel like a real warrior, in that he's trapped on Earth for presumably several weeks and he's got to get his help and fix his spaceship, and he's obviously bored, and so he thinks, well, I'll just have a bit of fun with the local natives and watch them slaughter each other because, hey, there's nothing else to do on a Friday night.
That's a good way of looking at it. I think I've just been reading too much Warhammer 40k where people just shoot each other in the face all the time and move on.
Well, that's true, but he also gets, as well as the memorable cliffhanger at the end of part 1 where he takes his helmet off and that's a wonderful image, the cliffhanger at the end of part 3 is actually that subversion of the thing where the baddie always has an excuse not to shoot the Doctor. And on this one, Lynx is like, okay, Doctor, do what I tell you or, I'm going to kill you. And the Doctor says, well, I'm not going to do what you like. And then Lynx says, okay, I'll kill you then. And actually goes for it. And was Sarah not there, would have killed the Doctor. And I just think that adds an extra level of seriousness and deadliness to them.
Oh yeah, like I began, he seems very capable and potentially quite deadly. I do like the character, I just wish it played out a little differently as well.
Fair enough. And of course he comes with a whole lot of baggage. We get the Sontaran armour, we get the Sontaran spaceship, which was all conveniently put into storage so that when they needed to do a very cheap story next season, they could.
Yes.
And that's the Sontaran experiment. Rob, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Yeah, this is probably the Sontaran I was most familiar with as a kid, thanks to repeats and such, and also being a shorter story, it tended to be one that I'd pull out from time to time more than others. The plot, though, of this story isn't much. I guess that's the case with most two-parters, but conversely, the length papers over any sort of cracks because it sort of starts and ends, in 50 minutes, and that's a good thing. And I guess the tie into Ark in Space makes it feel a bit bigger than it is, maybe. It just feels like a sort of a continuation of that story, which is a great story.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, it's another example of Sontarans being used for not very much. When you sit down and analyse it, it's a guy in a field, he's talking to his marshal who's somewhere else. There's not much to it.
No, it is another example of this phenomenon of this clone-produced species of millions, and we get one.
Yeah.
But what interests me is that clearly Kevin Lindsay was engaging on the set, and the production team admired his performance as much as we do. He doesn't just get to come back in Planet of the Spiders as part of the John Pertwee's Best Mates cast for that send-off. So obviously he got on well with them there. But when they're introducing Tom Baker after what was at the time a record-long stint as the Doctor by John Pertwee, that first season, you get the unit story that's very familiar and comfortable. You get a Dalek story. You get a Cyberman story, very clearly trying to make the audience feel comfortable. And the fact that the Sontarans are brought back in that mix does suggest that the production team, A, likes Kevin Lindsay. Yep, sure, absolutely. The costume and the spaceship and the materials are there, so it's cheap. Although they did redesign the mask. I want to talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But they clearly thought they were a big enough hit with the general public for them to be part of this whole easing Tom Baker into the role and familiarising himself with the public. So clearly, contemporaneously, the Sontarans were making a mark.
Easing him into the role by breaking his collarbone, I think he did on that story, Dave.
On his first day of location filming or something, wasn't it?
Oh, could you imagine?
Yeah, he genuinely thought he was going to lose his job. Wow.
Yeah.
The look is interesting because the dialogue clearly makes it implicit that we are meant to assume that every Sontaran we meet looks exactly the same, despite the fact that he looks nothing like Lynx. Did you buy that as a viewer, or were you just sort of like, what?
Look, as a very young viewer, I don't think I cared, but the more I'd sit down and think, they're clones. Well, shouldn't they look more similar? Yeah, it did annoy me a bit, but generally, though, it didn't annoy me that much. As I think back on it, by the time you get to, say, 2 doctors and there's 2 of them running around, they look different to each other. I didn't really care. They're even different heights.
No, well, that's right. And look, I think from a production point of view, we know that Kevin Lindsay had heart problems, and so giving him a much lighter and easier to wear mask was important. I like that Steyer is so ruthless, and I think if anything we can take away from these first couple of stories, it is again that the Sontarans are deadly, they are ruthless, they are not only willing to kill, they quite enjoy killing. There is a real sadistic quality to Steyer, and I think that does cement these as a credible and worthy and dangerous monster that starts to elevate them beyond just a couple of appearances.
Yeah, I do agree with that.
We should mention quickly that although we don't get a Sontaran story straight away, we do a couple of seasons later get a mention of their enemy, the Rutans.
Yes, I'll be very brief here, Dave. I've just jotted down here, Fang Rock is a bloody classic. What else can you say? Although the Rutan is a bit of a letdown.
Look, I like the Rutan. I think the voice is very good. I think it's really interesting, and it shows the relationship between Robert Holmes as creator of the Sontarans and Terrance Dicks as the creator of the Rutans, that Terrance Dicks did say, I'm going to give my mate's monster an enemy. I'm going to actually bring his enemy to life. He'd mentioned the Rutans before, and I like the thinking that if the Sontarans are these big, solid, muscle-bound bipeds, let's make the Rutans this amorphous, jelly-like fish.
Yeah.
That's a really good contrast. So I like that.
Okay. Well, we won't hang around on Fang Rock, though. We'll move on to Invasion of Time, eh?
We shall, where the Sontarans... I don't know whether to say that this is an epic appearance or not, because in the big season finale 6-part story, they're only in 2 episodes. Now, their appearance, as in that cliffhanger of part 4, is surely a top 10 cliffhanger in the history of the classic series.
Yeah, look, Dave, my notes here, I've jotted down, this is probably up there as the best Sontaran story in Classic Who, because they're actually doing what Sontarans are meant to do. They're attacking something, they're going for the big prize, there's more than one of them on screen. There are aspects of this story that shoot it down. Maybe we'll talk about those in a moment, but for me, this is probably the best of their appearances in Classic Who.
I think it is certainly the one that most lives up to the premise. And the fact that the Sontarans, okay, they're only in 2 episodes, but I think those 2 episodes are epic, because there are swarms of them, or at least as many swarms as a 1970s Doctor Who budget allows. But, they successfully invade Gallifrey.
Yeah.
They have a fleet out there of thousands of ships. They get inside the TARDIS and are a genuine threat to the Doctor. This is a very successful outing for them, I think, certainly in terms of what they're able to achieve. And the Doctor has to go to extraordinary lengths, mythical lengths, if you like, to actually get rid of the Sontarans once they've conquered Gallifrey. It's a big deal that perhaps, and you know, I hate to criticise Classic Who's budget, but I don't think the production team's quite up to the concept on this one. What do you reckon?
Oh, well, look, I've made a note of that bloody run they do through the TARDIS, particularly. I laugh even as I'm about to describe, particularly where that Sontaran does the little skip across the corner of the pool, like, oh, look at me, I'm awesome, I'm jumping over the pool. And then he gets to that sort of lawn chair and falls over it completely. And they don't do a retake.
Yeah, look, actually, that's a very cool little stunt. I actually do like it, although it is hilarious. As is the bit where the Sontaran backs into the sort of the giant plant and the Doctor shakes its hand. You know, that's a bit of comedy gold. I don't think it's the best thing for the Sontaran's integrity, though.
But yeah, so look, there are moments like that. The early episodes of the story too are quite confusing, where we don't know what the Doctor's doing, and then we've got Vardans and we've got Sontarans, you know. So there are aspects of the story that sort of shoot it in the foot as well. But in terms of the Sontarans themselves, for the episodes they're in, how they act, I do think this is super. I think this is good.
Fans criticise their appearance here, and particularly the way that Storr, the commander, is played. I've never actually had a problem or particularly noticed the, in inverted commas, Cockney accent. Maybe because we're not sort of as attuned to that as Australian viewers, Rob. Did you notice it?
Not at the time, no, but when people have mentioned it in years since, it's like, oh yeah, okay, yep, okay, I hear it now. And again, it shouldn't be there because they're clones, but I just go with it.
Yeah, it's something that needed to be pointed out to me to notice, and I'm pretty forgiving about it.
Yeah. Shall we move on?
Yeah, give us our next appearance, Rob.
Dave, we move on to a story I mentioned a moment ago, which is the Two Doctors, where we have Stike and Val as the two Sontarans. I'll go first. I think these guys are sort of painted into a corner almost from the start, you know, because people are just talking about androgums every 2 minutes in this story. It's like the Sontarans are sort of, you know, just pushed off to the side. One thing I do like about it, however, and we'll get onto this when we talk New Who, is here how big and tough they're shown to be. I mean, Stike gets messed up by sort of an exploding acid bomb, and then he gets super messed up by the time capsule, but he staggers on with that green goo dripping off him. And it's not so much the green goo that interests me. That's very 80s Doctor Who, the green goo.
Yeah.
It's just the way this guy is going to fight. Here he's fighting against the environment rather than an enemy, but he just keeps going. And that, to me, is scary. He's like the bad Terminator in Terminator 2. I love that. You know, I find this a very Sontaran thing to be doing. The way he's just had everything thrown in his face, quite literally. And he's just still going to smash everybody. He's just powering on. I love that. So it's a shame that they're otherwise not very integral or interesting in the story.
Yeah, I have a very mixed bunch of thoughts about the Sontarans in the Two Doctors. It's worth noting that, of course, this was written by Robert Holmes, the first time he comes back to write for them since he created Links in the Time Warrior. And he had the sad intention of wanting to use them properly because he didn't feel they'd been done justice in their other stories, which is interesting. I like their first appearance in terms of that scene in the scanner room. The guy spots the Sontaran ships and it's like, oh my god, Sontarans are coming, that big really cool Sontaran theme. Now if you're a fan and you know what a Sontaran is, that's a the Sontarans. If you're not and you're just a casual viewer, it's like, well, these are being built up, this is really cool. They take the station, they wipe out the station, they're very big baddies, they've got fleets, they're at war, they're a really big deal. I think it's a shame then that the depiction of them is probably, in terms of the look, the weakest of probably anywhere in the series, classic or new. They're bigger than they should be. They are a little bit sort of more gangly and sort of strutting around easily than they should be. And the fact that the masks haven't been stapled to the collars, like obviously haven't been stapled to the collars. And there are scenes where Stike bends over Patrick Troughton and you can see the edges of the mask. Like it's just such a stupid and lazy production decision to make that I think is really unfortunate. As you said, they get this big introduction and then they're just playing second fiddle to Jekyll and Pierce and Shockeye. And let's face it, if you're going to be overshadowed by anybody, Jekyll and Pierce and Shockeye, wow, you haven't got a chance.
No, that's right. Eventually, Stike just ends up being a leg that gets used as almost a comedy prop.
Yeah, it's a shame because I think that opening for them is really, really good. And Holmes is hinting at that big picture stuff. But the individuals, I just think they come off really weak. Like by the time you got Patrick Troughton's back and Fraser's back and Andrew Gums and Dastari and Time Travel and Spain and the Sontarans are there as well. Well, we're sort of over them. Let's move on.
Yeah. Oh, look, there are so many messy elements of that story. Like when Colin Baker lands on the space station, there's still smoke coming off one of the walls where lasers have hit it. And they say, oh, look, there's just been a battle. You can smell it in the air. At other times, they say the battle happened 10 to 12 days ago. And yet Fraser Hines as Jamie has gone almost feral. And I think, which is the right timeline here? Is the battle just happened? Is it 10 days old? Or is it longer than that? It's a very confusingly written story in places. Yeah,
there was a lot of rewriting on that one. And a lot of elements. I mean, famously, Holmes hated doing those shopping list stories. And I think it all isn't as good as it could have been. That said, though, because they had the actors and the costumes lying about, when Jim Will Fix It said we want to do a Doctor Who thing and give young Gareth... Is it?
Gareth Jenkins, I think.
Gareth Jenkins, that's it, yes. When young Gareth Jenkins wanted to appear in Doctor Who and J&T said to Eric Saywood, quick, write a story, use what we've got in the cupboard. They had Stike and Val in the cupboard, so we got a fix with Sontarans.
Yeah, and look, I think this is a really charming thing. And while I'm tempted to talk more about how I think Tegan would have gone really well with the Colin Baker Doctor, because I think she does.
Quick agree, yes.
Or the comedy naming of the Sontarans, we've got Group Marshal Nathan and Turner as the two Sontarans. Or indeed talk about how this is a banned sort of clip these days because, Jimmy Savile's in it. So it's actually deleted off DVDs and things. I've got it on my DVD, but the newer DVDs don't have it. I guess just to talk Sontarans, there's really not much to it. They're just there to be defeated by Gareth in 5 minutes and melt away on the floor into green goo, and that's the end.
Yeah, look, it is, but I guess whilst we sort of joke that they're there because, the costumes were around because they were filming the two Doctors, they are worthy enough for a general audience of saying, this is Doctor Who and these are a quintessential Doctor Who monster.
Agree. And can I just say, if I was given a prop gun like Gareth is at the end of the segment, I'd be a little more excited than he is. He just sort of stares with dead eyes into the distance.
Those guns are pretty cool, although I do like their wand guns, I must admit.
Yeah, true.
Now, I want to mention a bit here, Rob, the Wilderness Years, because the Sontarans are one of, I think, the unsung heroes of the Wilderness Years. In the same way that John Pertwee did a lot of work along with the others, but particularly Pertwee, of really sort of being the ambassador for the show and coming along and turning up. The Sontarans do a lot as well. Partly, I guess, because people wanted to use them. Partly, let's face it, because of copyright reasons. The Daleks and the Cybermen were too expensive. You couldn't get the copyright. You couldn't make the costumes. So suddenly the Sontarans are really filling that void. And, well, certainly their biggest outing was the Shakedown made-for-video film. Rob, have you seen it?
I have not. You're really? Flying solo here.
Okay. So, listeners, for those who don't know, 1994 was the height of these sort of professional in a production sense, but fan-made in that they're not official BBC sanctioned, Doctor Who, in inverted commas, but not with copyright problems, production. So, you get Doctor Who actors and Doctor Who things to come along and make stuff that's kind of like Doctor Who, but nobody says the words because, lawyers.
Yes.
I think comfortably the best of these was the shakedown, made-for-video movie. It was put together by Kevin Davies. It was written by Terrence Dicks. Mark Ayres was doing the music and the sound effects. It was filmed properly on the HMS Belfast. It had Sophie Aldred, Carol Ann Ford, Brian Croucher and Jan Chapel from Blake Seven, Michael Wisher, and it had the Sontarans.
It's a who's who of Doctor Who.
It really is. Like, this is as close to professionally made Doctor Who as we get in the Wilderness Years, I think.
Yeah.
And they were able to get the Sontarans, I think, partly because the estate was happy to use it, partly because Terrence Dicks was doing the script, so he was able to say to the Holmes estate, hey, you can trust me. And the Sontarans are redesigned here because they didn't have the copyright to use their old costumes. But they're really, really effective. They're small again, they're stout, they've got these very sort of metallic material costumes. They take over the ship when they invade in seconds. They're really, really effective. They do have this wonderful interplay where the commander's a very serious Sontaran and his lieutenant's a little bit thick, which is really kind of fun. But they're very deadly. There's a moment when they kill Sophie Aldred's character's boyfriend in a really callous and ruthless way. They're fighting a Ruton, so they're there to catch a Ruton, and it's really, really a good use of them, and it is one of the flagships of the Wilderness Years. So I think it's on YouTube. It's worth checking out. It's only an hour. It's quite good, and it did lead to being novelised as part of the New Adventures, which is a very good book, and again written by Terrence Dicks, and I enjoy, and that really goes into a lot more of the Sontarans and the way the New Adventures would, sort of, how the Sontaran scouts are thinking and how they're strategizing and how they're working with each other. That's really, really interesting. And David McGinty did a tie-in missing adventure, Lords of the Storm, set during the Davison era, which is also a really, really good book. And both of them really take the Sontarans in a much more detailed place than the TV series did, and were, big deals at the time. I can remember it being announced. The Sontarans are coming back in these books. Something I think you have seen, though, Rob, is More Than 30 Years in the TARDIS.
Oh, yes. Originally 30 years in the TARDIS, then More Than 30 Years in the TARDIS. Wonderful, wonderful documentary, in general.
It is, and I think we just need to mention in passing that one of the things that is used to tie that documentary together is a Sontaran.
Yeah, it is. And a reasonably well done one, too, considering this is a tiny budgeted, almost a fan-made... Well, it is a fan-made sort of documentary, I believe.
It's very, very cheap, but he gets to play alongside Elizabeth Sladen, which was really cool.
Yeah, Elizabeth Sladen, her daughter when she was very young.
Sadie, yes.
Sadie, it's a wonderful documentary, and I'm so glad it was released on DVD. Check it out, people, if you've not seen it. It's worth it.
Yeah, it is really, really nice, but yes, the Sontarans get to be a key, again, alongside a Dalek and a Cyberman, a key thing that threads through that documentary and holds it together. And I wanted to give a very quick mention as well to, at a similar time in the Wilderness Years, the DWM comic Pure Blood, which does feature the Sontarans, and the conceit here is that the Rutons have actually discovered a long-lost colony of pre-clone era Sontarans. And so they're the Sontarans before they've had to start fighting the Rutons and turn themselves into a clone race and be made for war. And so they are pure blood Sontarans, as the title of the comic says. And
do they have relations with each other? How do they breed?
It doesn't go into that level of detail in Doctor Who magazine, Rob, I'm afraid. But how they interact then and how they respond to meeting modern era Sontarans is kind of the premise of that comic, and that's actually a really interesting and enjoyable story, and another example of just how the Sontarans just kept the show ticking along at a time when it wasn't being made.
I like the sound of that. Of course, it brings us to the new series, though, and I mentioned earlier, the Sontarans really arguably only have one real appearance in New Who to date, despite being so well known in New Who, and that's the Sontaran Stratagem and Poison Sky episodes during the Tennant era. I'll take lead here, Dave, and say, although to me these are the midget comedy Sontarans, we can talk about that in a minute, I think this is their best TV outing, period, across classic and New Who, because there's an interesting plot, and here we go. I said I'd mention this at the start of the show. Here, finally, loads of Sontarans, or at least the sense that there's loads of them. I'm actually surprised when we look at the rest of New Who how badly they've been used after this, because I think this was a very decent first outing in New Who for Sontarans, aside from the fact they're midget comedy Sontarans.
Look, I don't think I can argue with any of that. I think after bringing the Daleks back and it being incredibly successful, bringing the Cybermen back and it being contestable, I think, how well that was done. The Sontarans, I think, are definitely a much stronger one. They are, again, very well depicted. As you say, there are thousands of them. They've got big, cool spaceships. They're successful in their invasion until the Doctor comes along. They are dangerous. They are deadly. They look good. And it's a very good story. And, you know, when you first said it's their best outing out of the whole series, my first reaction was, no, it's not. And then I thought, what's better? And I can't give you an answer to that. So I think you probably are right.
Yeah, look, I gave it some thought, and quite honestly, that's my honest opinion on this. Can we talk about them becoming midgets, though, Dave? Because I have this argument with people all the time. I say Sontarans were always really bulky sort of blokes. They might not have been, 6'5" guys, but they were always pretty solid and stocky. You watch the Time Warrior, he's almost as tall as all the other characters in the show. You look at the still photos, he's almost as tall as Pertwee, albeit with the helmet on. To go to this miniature sort of size in New Who, I don't like.
I don't have a problem with it. You are right that they are, in the original series, stocky. They're not midgets. They are short and stocky, but they are still, let's face it, they are Kevin Lindsay's height. And Kevin Lindsay was within the gamut of a normal-sized man.
Yes.
I kind of like the idea, though, that perhaps the classic series would have done it if they could have done it. And this is kind of really taking them to a level that the technology allows. Much like when the Daleks suddenly, the mid-six section of the Daleks swivels around independently and we can see them flying so much more naturally. They would have done that in the classic series, but they couldn't afford to. I think this is just a logical extension of what the budget allows.
I just think, though, when it's teamed up with the comedy aspects, it just makes them a little silly.
No, I think that it lulls people into a false sense of security. It is that thing of, oh, look at those things, they're midgets, they're silly, oh my god, they just shot me.
Yeah, there is that. Now, Dave, I mentioned that this is basically their only real outing in New Who, yet there's a ton of cameos and sort of spin-offs that happen after this.
Yes, Rob, so look, there are a number of cameos and mentions in the next few years. Turn Left has that moment in the parallel universe, if you like, where the Doctor's dead, where the Sontaran stratagem and the poison sky are mentioned, and the Sontaran's plan, it said, is foiled by Torchwood, and Jack Harkness is captured by them, and that's a big deal. In the Stolen Earth, it's revealed that the teleportation technology that Unit is using has been actually stolen from the Sontarans. It's left over from their first appearance.
Yep.
And I think perhaps the more interesting, we do get a survivor of the Poison Sky, Commander Karg, who does appear in The Last Sontaran in the Sarah Jane Adventures, which is a really fun episode that, again, kind of goes back to the roots of the Sontarans and just has a lot of fun with Sarah. And then in the return appearance of Karg in Enemy of the Bane, the Brigadier, that's the episode that Nicholas Courtney appeared in just before he died, in fact, where they do kind of enjoy this premise of one Sontaran and Sarah and the Brigadier, and they're really fun adventures.
Yeah, I've seen neither of those. I've seen very little Sarah Jane Adventures. I know there are probably half our listeners out there switching off in disgust at hearing that. One day I'm going to have to sit down and actually watch them properly. I just haven't seen them.
Yeah, I've skipped in and out of them, and given that there was a Sontaran, given there was Nick Courtney, these were ones I made a point of watching. Yeah, they do them really well, and I think it again shows that where the individual Sontaran character is interesting and good and well played, it really does elevate the race in a significant way.
Now, these cameos and mentions keep coming, Dave. In The End of Time Part 2, Tennant's finale, there's a Sontaran sniper played by Dan Starkey, who will come up quite a bit in a moment, and he's trying to kill Mickey and Martha, who are now husband and wife.
That's right, I forgot about that one, yes.
Yeah, but the Doctor defeats them. It's part of that never-ending epilogue to
the long goodbye, yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, there are Sontaran battle fleets in the Series 5 finale, which is the Pandorica Opens. All the Doctor's enemies show up. There are Sontarans there as well. Then we get to Series 6, and this is where things get interesting, because in A Good Man Goes to War, we're introduced to the character of Strax, who is a Sontaran nurse. I don't think he originally starts as a nurse, but he is a nurse at this point where we meet him. He then teams up with the Doctor and his allies, which means he meets Madame Vastra and Jenny. He then becomes part of the Paternoster gang, and subsequently turns up in many episodes like The Snowman, Crimson Horror, Name of the Doctor, and Deep Breath, if I have them all correct.
Yeah, so look, let's have the Strax conversation, because that's an important part of any Sontarans conversation.
Strax conversation. Why does that have inverted commas around it, Dave?
Because I think that he is a controversial character in Doctor Who amongst fandom.
Yeah.
So, look, you talk about sacrifices I make for the podcast. I actually watched A Good Man Goes to War on the weekend.
Yes.
That is a mess of a story, let me say. Absolute mess of a story. But I was really pleasantly surprised about how effective and how much I enjoyed Strax in that episode. Because in that story, he actually has a defined character arc that works really, really well. He's found on the battlefield where the Doctor has made him, as an atonement for something we don't know about, made him become a nurse. You know, it is that sort of Greek tragedy punishment where the great warrior, the great killer, has to become a healer as his punishment, which is a really neat idea. He comes along with the Doctor. And then you sort of get these moments of actually genuinely quite funny comedy where he's now mixing his medical language with his military language. And that leads to some quite good gags and some quite good moments. But he still feels like a very capable, very dangerous Sontaran warrior. He supports the Doctor. He has a role. He is then killed. And as he dies, he says, "No, I am a nurse," and kind of embraces that part of him. And so that makes a nice little character arc. And I thought, okay, maybe I've underestimated Strax. I then went and flicked through sort of various scenes from some of his other appearances. And no, because once he comes back, he is a bumbling idiot.
Yes.
And look, there is a line that I'd forgotten where they say, oh, as part of the process of bringing him back to life, maybe, you know, he didn't come back quite, you know, proper, or, you know, he's a bit thick or something. But he is just a comedy relief in most of those episodes. Now, sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. And to give you an example, I watched the first part of Name of the Doctor. I watched as far as I could before I gave up. So that's a really bad episode. Yeah. In the cold open, there's that bit where Strax has gone to Glasgow on his weekend off to get into bar fights. Now, as part of a kind of a fun, where's all our characters cold open, that's a really cool, funny moment. And that's really appropriate. I like that. But about 10 minutes later, you get to the scene where they're all in that vision. They're all sort of unconscious and they're in that telepathic vision together. And Jenny thinks that someone's broken into the house and she's about to be killed. And Strax gets the line, "Speak up, boy." And, you know, he's doing this whole, oh, he can't tell men from women thing, which has now become, I think, an overworn trope about Strax. And in a height of real tension, of real danger, where, you know, a semi-regular character has been killed, to have comedy relief Strax in there being comedy relief totally undermines the episode and the character.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I actually quite like the Jenny character. And I remember not liking that at the time, not at all.
Yeah, it really reminds me of something that happens in a lot of TV shows. I think Zathras from Babylon 5 is a really good example, where a character comes in for a show. They have a character that works extremely well in that episode. Clearly the actor delivers. Clearly the actor gets on very well with the production team. And Dan Starkey is a very capable actor, and he clearly did hit it off with the production team. So they bring him back a number of times.
Yeah.
But removed from that initial appearance, that initial rationale for existing, never quite works the same way again. And I think that is the problem with Strax. Conceding that probably for some viewers, and particularly younger viewers, he would be a really funny and interesting character. I just don't think comedy relief Sontaran works again and again and again in Doctor Who. I've given a lot of comments there, Rob. Over to you.
Yeah, look, completely agree. And I'll just say, I think it comes down to Moffat loves to write comedy. He loves to write comedy into everything he does. You know, so you can see where that's coming from. And he just can't resist some of the stuff he gets Strax to do. But it's to the show's detriment as time goes on. I don't like it at all.
And look, probably the nadir of the Strax character, and yes, it was a late intro, but the medical examination scene in Deep Breath is... I watched that again for this. I was sort of skipping through the various Strax scenes for this. And that medical examination scene is just puerile. It's really, really bad. I thought I was going to come in here to completely smash Strax, but look, huge points to him for his first appearance. That was really, really good. It's the subsequent ones that just don't work.
Yeah, and don't worry, listeners, we'll have some positive comments coming up on Strax in a moment. But first, to round out Sontaran mentions in New Who, a troop of Sontarans is shown among Trenzalor's invaders in the 2013 Christmas special, The Time of the Doctor, and a Sontaran does appear briefly in Face the Raven as a refugee in that little side street they've got where people go to hang out.
Yeah, that's a really nice touch, I think. I remember seeing that and thinking that was a really cool touch.
Yeah. So, across the new series, again, only one real story, a two-parter, then just lots of mentions and Strax appearing in stories that aren't really Sontaran stories. But it's just spread Sontarans and the idea of them throughout New Who. Every New Who fan knows Sontarans.
You're right. They are very, very important. And I think it's because, in part, you can put anybody into the costume, but also because the Sontarans are still characters in a way that the Daleks and the Cybermen simply aren't. So you can have a lone Sontaran, you can have a renegade Sontaran, you can have a refugee Sontaran, you can have a funny Sontaran, you have a serious Sontaran. You can do those things that you just couldn't do with a Dalek or Cyberman, even though they're a more well-known monster.
Now, moving away from the show to something we haven't discussed and something we really can't discuss because neither you or I, Dave, have listened to a lot of Big Finish, particularly Big Finish featuring Sontarans, I think that's fair to say.
Yes.
So I reached out to Dwayne Bunny, friend of the show, who does the Sirens of Audio podcast, and if you're into Big Finish, this is a podcast you should really be listening to.
Oh, absolutely.
Dwayne has wonderful thoughts on Big Finish and a lot of really great guests as well. So listen to him and Philip Edney, and I think you'll really enjoy it. I got him to pen a few words, Dave. Shall I read these out about Big Finish?
No, please. That's I think, a very important contribution.
Yeah, I thought so too, because I knew we didn't have much to say.
That's right.
On Sontarans in Big Finish, Dwayne says, "It's difficult to talk about Sontarans in Big Finish because generally I love Big Finish. But what this format allows is to be able to tell stories from earlier in the Doctor's history. For example, the Sontarans is the story of the first time the first Doctor encounters them. That's a great story. But more recently, we have the ongoing story of the Paternoster Gang, where our Sontaran nurse Strax, played by Dan Starkey, continues to hit his performance out of the park. His comic timing is perfect. It would have been great to have Strax at some point coming up against another or some other Sontarans. I don't know if we'll get Strax again on TV, so if you want more of him or any other number of original Sontaran stories, Big Finish is the way to go. Like the Cybermen," I like this part, Dave, "like the Cybermen, the Sontarans are more often than not served less well on screen than we imagine they should be. The audio medium allows them to shine as they should."
I think that's a really good point, because audio, of course, is the medium in which you can have a million Sontarans and it doesn't cost you anything. So that's really interesting. I didn't know that there was a Sontaran First Doctor story. That's one I will make a point of checking out. So thank you, Dwayne, for the recommendation.
Yeah.
And yeah, look, I can imagine Strax in a Paternoster Gang story where the tone and the vibe is designed around them, actually working far better than being sort of inserted into Doctor Who, which, you know, depending on your opinion, his vibe may or may not quite gel.
Yeah, I think when you're watching Doctor Who, there's an expectation we're there for Doctor Who. We're not there for Strax to be an ass, you know, in some side story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, look, thank you again, Dwayne. That is really great. And we'll also hear from Dwayne's co-host, Philip, later in the episode.
So, look, we've covered all of the Sontarans' appearances. I guess there are two questions we need to ask. One is to answer the question we posed at the start about whether they have lived up to their premise. And the other is, I think, how do we feel about them now, and do we want them back? And if so, how? Which of those would you like to tackle first, Rob?
Oh, look, let's start with if they've lived up to their premise.
Did they? I'm going to say not often enough.
Yeah, I wanted to say no, but it was with qualifications, and I think that qualification is not often enough. Yeah, I'm with you there.
Yeah, there are some wonderful Sontaran characters, and there are some good attempts to have an army of mass clones. I don't think that they ever quite get there well, and they certainly don't get there consistently. You're right, Poison Skies and Time Stratagem is the best of them.
Oh, it's just got so much to it. I think the plot around, the devices in the cars is very good. I think cloning Martha Jones is very good. Unit is shown as sort of the nasty sort of side of Unit. That's not as good, but, you can't have everything.
Look, I have long thoughts about the new series depiction of Unit, and I won't open that can of worms this episode. But yes. Look, I think you're right. I think it's a very good depiction of them, and the budget does help. I mean, let's face it, in original Doctor Who, in classic Doctor Who, when you see in a script the line Army of Millions, you know that's not going to happen. It's going to be Army of 4.
Yeah, exactly. Walking through the same door a few times.
So, look, I'll perhaps take the question of, do we want to see them back? And look, I definitely would like to see them back. I would like to see the Rootons introduced into New Who. I think that would be very, very cool. And I think that modern CGI would allow you to do them really, really well. I want to see the Sontarans somewhere out there in the galaxy. Not on Earth, not on Gallifrey, not on future Earth, anything like that. I want to see big Sontaran battle fleets out in the galaxy in a real space opera sort of thing. That's my wish for the Sontarans.
Okay. My answer is yes, I'd like to see them back, if they can be done well. I know we're probably stuck with this dwarf sort of size because they won't want to go back to normal size, but the overt comedy could be toned down for starters. It's hard, well, for me at least, it's hard to feel tension or to have drama if some potato is getting around barking orders and acting like General Melchett in Blackadder, which is kind of how they act. You just want one, don't you, Dave, to come on and break someone's jaw and shoot someone else in the face and say, okay, bitches, who wants to dance? You just want that. You just want to say, oh, crap, here's some peril. This guy's really bad, When it's done just for comedy, it's really hard to get wrapped up in it, at least for me. My mind starts to wander and I think, why are we even bothering? So, yes, give them a new lease of life, but as long as it's just that, something new.
Yeah, and I think that's why going out into space would be very effective, because at the end of the day, the Sontarans can't conquer the planet Earth, and they can't conquer the planet Gallifrey either, but they can conquer the planet Zog.
Yes, exactly.
And certainly them fighting Rootons is something that, outside of Shakedown, the show just hasn't done, and I think could.
Well, let's go to our listeners now on Sontarans. How about we tic-tac back and forth on these, Dave? Because we've got a lot of comments.
Absolutely. Should you kick us off, Rob?
All right, this one is from Dave Young, who wrote us a fairly long email about Sontarans. Thank you so much, Dave. I'm just going to cherry pick one paragraph from it because you also have a separate email at the end of the show. So, we can't make this the Dave Young show. Dave says on Sontarans, can they return? Oh, this is good. This is tying into what we were talking about. Can they return? I think yes, but it will need to be a reboot back to the past. We have seen this happen with the Cybermen at the close of the Capaldi era, and in the last series that they can be a menacing threat. Think the same thing can be done of the Sontarans, but they need to be that original, harsh, brutal force we first met, and there must be an end to the comedy. Yeah, look, I broadly agree with that.
Yeah, look, fair enough. Another piece that came in via Facebook from Ian McArdle. Thanks for writing in. As much as I enjoyed Dan Starkey's performance as Strax, that's an interesting qualifier. I wonder where this is going to go. As much as I enjoyed Dan Starkey's performance as Strax, are they now done with the role of villains and stuck with the role of comic relief forever? Do we need a Sontaran episode like we had Dalek to re-establish them as a credible threat? Ooh. Another thought. In terms of the 70s and 80s, I don't think they ever bettered the Time Warrior. Diminishing returns after that. It seemed as though they got progressively taller and less threatening. Agreed. That said, I'd like them in the Two Doctors, even if they play second fiddle to the sublime Shassini and the grotesque Shockeye. Agree with everything you said there, Ian.
Yeah, good comments. Moving on to Philip Edney from Sirens of Audio. He says, Robert Holmes created a marvellous race that allowed for deeper and deeper exploration. Lynx is so morally ambivalent about the consequences of his actions on others by supplying totally inappropriate weapons, and Steyr only cares about the mission. Our first true sociopaths. Wow.
Yeah, look, I think that comment about Steyr is really good. I like that.
Yeah.
A comment here from a friend of the podcast, from the Diddly Dum podcast, Hayden Gribble. And congratulations, Hayden, on some recent good news. Those who know will know. But congratulations. And he says, never really taken to them. As an iconic villain race, they are probably at the bottom of my list. Can't say any of their stories are classics either.
Ooh. Tough call.
Yeah, look, I disagree. I enjoy their stories. Are any of them out-and-out classics, though, in the way a lot of Dalek and Cyberman ones are? Yeah, maybe not. I don't think there are classics in that list.
Invasion of Time gets talked about a lot. Maybe not as a classic, but maybe just as a big sort of story.
Yeah, that's true. So, no, look, don't agree with you there, Hayden, but no, interesting perspective, and I think that is perhaps another reason why they sort of aren't universally thought of as that number 3 villain.
Yeah, and maybe Two Doctors gets pulled out a bit because, hey, it's got Patrick Troughton in it, but again, that's because it's got Patrick Troughton, not the Sontarans.
Yeah.
Moving on to Millie McKenzie at Cowbear Creates. This is Millie McKenzie, of course, listeners, who is creating all those wonderful figurines you're seeing us retweet on Twitter, so check those out when you can. Millie says, Lynx and Steyr are great creations. Their mask is creepy and kind of gross with that tongue and tufts of hair. Their character, brutal and unfeeling. The remainder of classic Sontarans leave me wanting. Modern ones are quite bland somehow, although I love Strax as a fun character.
Yeah, you see, Strax has got fans.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's kind of like 50-50 as far as I see, Dave.
I reckon it really is, and I think that makes it a very interesting proposition. From the All of Time and Space and Nerdology podcast, Mark Cockram, who says, Hi, Rob and David. The first Sontaran story I can recall would be The Two Doctors, which coincided with our family getting a shiny new piece of technology called a VHS recorder. Ask your grandparents, kids. And as a consequence, the 12-year-old me watched this story on heavy rotation. I thought Steyr and Val were worthy adversaries for the Doctors, and their demise was a particularly memorable moment from season 22. Young me must have been suitably impressed by them, as the first pre-recorded Doctor Who tape I bought was The Time Warrior.
Oh.
I think that they're incredibly menacing as an adversary in the classic series, which reaches its zenith in the Sontaran experiment, where they're just flat-out sadistic. And the impact of their cliffhanger appearance in the Invasion of Time was, in my opinion, a standout moment from that era of the show. Let's gloss over the dodgy Cockney accents and the Sun Lounger-related mishaps.
I'm glad we've mentioned both of those already.
Yeah, we've given those a context, yeah. I enjoy Dan Starkey's Strax as a comedy sidekick, but I'm afraid the new series version has never really worked for me. Even before the decision to make them a source of comic relief, I just found them a little underwhelming in comparison to the more lauded returning monsters. Thanks for letting me ramble on, and I look forward to hearing your 2-hour Nyman extravaganza next month. Cheers, Mark.
Oh, yeah. Coming never.
I don't know. I reckon a Horns of Nymon special would be fun one day. Maybe it's a Christmas special.
Yeah, all right.
Maybe not then.
We'll see. Moving on. Oscar Groucho, tweeting at Oscar Grouchos, says, I feel that their definitive episode is yet to be written. Perhaps an allegory of the sheer horror of warfare, a generation of warriors bred to die, and it's an utter tragedy that we never got Brian Blessed as the Sontar King. How about
wonderful
that?
Idea. Yeah. Look, I think that Oscar's kind of in tune with what we said earlier, that they've never perhaps quite reached their full potential.
Agree.
Jeff Waddle says via Facebook, apart from the initial appearance of Lynx, they, like so many other returning villains, have been a diminishing success. He wasn't in the slightest comedic, neither was Steyr, come to think of it, but I found all the experiments a bit too pervy. But after that, forget it, to the extent we now have a full comedy relief one in Strax, when the whole point of them should be that they are thoroughly warlike. Great concept for a villain, but has been too watered down from its original concept.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, echoing some of our thoughts there. And, yeah, look, it really is breaking 50-50 on Strax, I think.
Yeah, it really is. This tweet is from Shaney, who tweets at Shanoid77. One of the more well-rounded of the Doctor Who monsters, I think. Their code sets them apart from generic villain motivations. I'd recommend the first Sontaran story from Big Finish, as it tucks into the potato heads nicely. Thumbs up.
And finally, for listener comments on the Sontarans, Citizen23 Voter 87, or at Paul Toey Jr., he says, I remember first watching them with Pertwee and thought they were horrifying. I liked how their actual heads were developed in the new series, but missed the original suits. I also think they get a good backstory as added when we see them again with Tennant.
Well, there you go. So, another vote for New Who Sontarans.
Yeah, look, I think a genuine range of mixed thoughts, but some themes coming through there. But need to note that the Sontarans really motivated people to write in. I think that's a record for us.
Yeah, look, we only went out with the call on social media about 48 hours ago, and and we got all of those responses. I was blown away by that, frankly.
They're a villain and a monster that I think people have strong opinions on.
Yeah, to use a football analogy, they're the team that always finishes about 9th or 10th on the ladder. They're never up the top, but they're never down the bottom.
So Richmond.
Very good. A team neither of us support, so we can say that.
They're the Richmond Sontarans.
Very good.